They say that some files were not meant to be read in daylight. Some belong to the damp silence of wooden drawers, to the smell of old paper and dust that has not seen the sun since the 19th century. As we listen to this reconstruction, leave just a discreet trace in the present. Write in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. It is as if, in this way, we could measure the exact distance between their time and yours. The records that speak of Briar Hollow, dating from 1891, do not begin with the disappearance. They begin, like almost everything in that rural America, with a list of debts, church notices, and notes about harvests. A book with a darkened brown cover, with cracked leather at the edges, bears the name of the small community at the top of the page, Briar Hollow Township, handwritten in ink that time has turned to a grayish brown. It was a place nestled between hills covered with oak and pine trees, where the fog used to linger late over the fields, as if the day hesitated to begin. The wooden houses, some made of stacked logs, others with aligned boards and glass windows, were scattered along a dirt road, cutting through the town like a single irregular line. In the center stood a white wooden church, now yellowed, with a small tower and a cracked bell. Next to it was the general store, the community barn, and further on the sheriff's small office. Briar Hollow was less a point on the map and more a point of return. Those who were born there almost always died there. It was a community of farmers, woodcutters, and hunters who learned early on to respect winter, the forest, and silence. The nights, especially in late fall, were long, cold, and punctuated by the crackling of branches in the woods and the distant howling of some animal that no one was in a hurry to identify. Among the names that appear repeatedly in these records, one appears with increasing frequency in the months leading up to the disappearance of the 30 hunters: Silas Crowley. The church's tithe book records his name alongside small amounts of coins. Another notebook, with notes from the store, indicates purchases of salt, gunpowder, lead bullets, kerosene, and thick fabric for coats. And finally, there is a more intimate record. A note from the local pastor mentioning Silas's marriage to Margaret Ann Holloway 2 years before the events of 1891. Silas Crowley, according to testimonies collected decades later, was a 28-year-old man with broad shoulders and a posture that mixed fatigue and obstinacy. He had hands marked by calluses, sunburned skin, and a poorly trimmed beard that he never let grow too long. He was seen as a skilled hunter, one of those who could read footprints in wet clay as if they were sentences that the rest of the world had not been literate enough to understand. The house where he lived with Margaret was set back from the main road, on the edge of a hill that allowed a view of almost the entire small community. It was a simple dark wood construction with a narrow porch in front and a small makeshift shed in the back. There he kept traps, ropes, skins drying on rusty nails, and the rifle that had accompanied him since his youth. Neighbors described him as a quiet but not unfriendly man. He did not talk much at church meetings, nor did he linger in conversations at the store. He greeted people with a brief nod, paid what he owed, and took what he needed. His voice was heard more in the forest than among people, when he called his hunting dogs or murmured short orders to the other men in the group during expeditions. Margaret, on the other hand, was the complementary opposite. In accounts preserved in letters and oral memoirs, she appears as a soft-spoken woman with a restrained smile but a striking presence. She helped other wives with childbirth, sewing, and small herbal remedies. Next to the couple's bed, according to one witness who described it many years later, there was always an open Bible, and on top of it, a folded sheet of paper with a list of bills, future purchases, and a small drawing of a larger house with more windows, a project that may never have left her imagination. The year 1891 arrived in Briar Hollow, looking much the same as always. Frost in the early days, thick mud on the trails, a winter sky that seemed to weigh heavier than the roof boards. But in the community records, something begins to change subtly from the end of February. The church book begins to record, with some insistence, specific prayer meetings for the men who will be away in the coming weeks. The store records an increase in the purchase of ammunition, dry goods, and oil lamps. Small signs, scattered across yellowed pages, that a larger expedition was being prepared. Briar Hollow depended on hunting not only as a source of food, but also as a form of trade. According to reports, that winter had been particularly harsh, and stocks of salted meat, skins, and fat for sale were lower than expected. The men who knew how to track animals beyond the known limits of the forest began to talk, in hushed tones, about a longer, more distant foray that could guarantee supplies for the entire following year. Silas Crowley emerges in this context as a central figure. Some accounts describe him as the one who insisted on the idea of going deeper beyond the stone markers. Others suggest that he was just one of many who accepted, out of necessity, to participate in something bigger than usual. What is known for certain is that his presence is recorded on all preserved lists of the men who would leave. The Briar Hollow Sons, as they came to be called in the newspapers of a larger city, which would only learn of this story after it had all happened, were basically that: sons of the land, the forest, and the cold. Men whose names, lined up on a sheet of paper, today seem like nothing more than old ink, but at the time meant fathers, husbands, brothers, nephews. 30 hunters, 30 stories compressed into a column of names, approximate age, type of weapon, whether or not they had families. The researcher who, decades later, would compile all this, a professor of rural history interested in isolated communities at the end of the 19th century, described the feeling of opening that set of notebooks for the first time. He speaks of a smell of mold and smoke, the rough texture of the pages, and the careful handwriting of the pastor who wrote everything down in slanted letters. He also speaks of the silence of the small archive room, broken only by the sound of his own pencil making notes in the margins. However, it was when he turned to the following pages, already in the middle of 1891, that something really out of place appeared. Among the list of 30 men who left for the forest that fall, there is a pause in the handwriting, a larger space between the lines, as if the hand that wrote had hesitated. Just below, in a less controlled, almost nervous handwriting, the tone of the record changes. The paper, in this section, seems thinner. The ink is darker, as if it had been pressed too hard onto the page. Next to Silas Crowley's name, someone wrote in smaller letters an expression that does not appear anywhere else in the book: confessional. There is no explanation, no context, no complete sentence. Just these two words, isolated in the margin, like a shadow caught between the list of names and the void left by the pages that follow. And it is precisely from this small deviation in the handwriting, this solitary, enigmatic, and almost guilty note, that the silence surrounding Briar Hollow begins. Because, after the departure of the 30 hunters, the records continue, but they no longer speak of them as men who are present. What happened between that list of names and the moment Briar Hollow began to speak of them in the past is what the archives still try, in vain, to explain. And it is this gap, this sequence of pages where details are missing but marks of hesitation remain, that we will now traverse. To understand the disappearance of the 30 hunters, the records suggest that we must go back a few weeks before their departure, when Briar Hollow still seemed intact, when the silence of the forest was just part of the landscape and not an omen. Silas Crowley's life during this period, pieced together from letters, testimonies, and neighbors' memories, allows us to reconstruct with some clarity the daily life that preceded the collective disappearance. Silas woke up before sunrise. The morning chill used to seep through the cracks in the wood, and he kept up the habit of stoking the fire in the wood stove before even putting on his boots. Margaret said in one of her letters to her sister who lived in Ashland that this morning ritual, the sound of the shovel scraping the embers, the orange light reflected on his face, made the house seem bigger, less vulnerable to winter. These were times when small tasks had emotional value: chopping wood, boiling water, checking traps, cleaning the rifle. All of this was, in a way to keep life moving. In the late afternoon, the couple would sit on the narrow porch in silence, watching the fog descend from the hills. Margaret would embroider, with small, slow stitches, a towel that she said was for the table in the new house. Silas, beside her, sharpened a knife blade or tied knots in a rope. The sound of crickets, the crackling of wood in the cold, and the wind blowing through the woods created a kind of constant, familiar background that gave the place its identity. Nothing on the surface suggested that Briar Hollow would be the scene of one of the most talked-about disappearances of the late 19th century. But it is in the small details, in the fragments that often go unnoticed, that researchers found clues that something was not quite right in Silas's routine. Two neighbors reported in interviews conducted almost 40 years later that they had seen him go out alone into the woods a few times at dawn, without dogs, without traps, carrying only a folded notebook in the inside pocket of his coat. This was unusual. Silas was not a man of letters. He didn't leave notes or keep a diary. When questioned at the time, Margaret said she knew nothing about any notebook. Another recurring point in the testimonies is the subtle change in the behavior of Silas's dogs. They were trained animals, accustomed to the forest and the trails of the valley, but they began to act restless during the night. Short barks, always directed in the same direction. The northern edge of the woods, where an old abandoned cabin stood among twisted logs and moss-covered rocks. The cabin, according to residents, had belonged to a woodcutter who had died decades earlier. Since then, no one had used it. Still, for a few weeks, Silas's dogs seemed to sense something coming from that direction, something that made them alert, ears pricked, bodies tense. Margaret recounted the most striking episode of this phase in a letter found among her belongings. She wrote that one night in March, she woke up to find Silas sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, staring at the floor. She asked if he was okay. He replied only, something was missing. She insisted on knowing what, but he shook his head, got up and went out onto the porch. He stood there until dawn, motionless, as if waiting for someone to arrive on the dark road. These observations, isolated in time, could be attributed to fatigue, the weight of responsibility, or even the harshness of that winter. But they take on another meaning when added to the growing movement of preparation that took hold of Briar Hollow in early spring. The men began to meet more often, not only for community work, but for conversations that, according to witnesses, always took place away from women and young people. The groups formed at the warehouse door, on the side of the church, behind the barn. Silas was seen in almost all of these circles, although he spoke little. Or rather, he spoke too softly for anyone, decades later, to be able to reproduce his words exactly. Another significant clue comes from the pastor's records. He noted on 2 occasions that some men, including Silas, asked for spiritual guidance before their departure. One note in particular stands out. It reads, "I spoke to them about guilt and redemption. They seemed restless. One of them mentioned the need to right an old wrong before winter returned." The identity of this man was not specified, but the word redemption is underlined, as if the pastor considered the term too important to go unnoticed. In the weeks that followed, the routine in Briar Hollow was divided between ordinary work and silent preparations for the great expedition. Clothes were sewn from thicker fabric, muskets were serviced, dogs were trained for long journeys. The women, for their part, avoided asking for details. There was a kind of unspoken agreement in the local culture. The forest had its own laws, and the men who ventured beyond the known trails knew that explaining too much could bring bad luck. Thus, each wife limited herself to providing what she could: supplies, men's blankets, little prayers left among their belongings. Margaret, however, seemed more apprehensive than the others. Her account suggests that she sensed a particular tension in Silas, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't find a way to put into words. The last letter sent to her sister, dated a few weeks before departure, contains a phrase that has been quoted several times in studies of the case. "Silas looks at me as if he were going to resolve something that existed even before the two of us." It is the kind of phrase that only gains weight in light of the tragedy that would follow. But at the time, it was just an intimate comment, an outburst from a woman concerned about a husband who seemed to be carrying more than the weight of a long journey. When the newspapers finally reported the disappearance, they simplified the men's motivations: hunger, necessity, trade, survival. But the preserved documents tell another story, one with nuances, hesitations and small silences that don't fit in headlines. According to the lists, the expedition of 30 hunters was to depart in early April to avoid heavy rains and take advantage of the partial melting of snow in the higher areas. The men planned to go beyond the traditional limits, crossing the ravine known as Hollow Creek and climbing toward the denser hills where, they said, there were still large numbers of deer and elk. But something happened in the days immediately before their departure. Something that, to this day, is unknown whether it was an omen, a coincidence, or just the kind of shadow that only takes shape when you look back. On the morning of April 2nd, 2 days before departure, Silas was seen again walking alone toward the northern edge of the forest, the same spot where his dogs were barking. He wore his coat buttoned up to his neck, his rifle on his back, and according to a woodcutter's account, a look as if he were going to meet someone he hadn't seen in a long time. That would be the last time he would be seen alone. After that, his name appears only in the collective records of the departure. A silent march of 30 men who left Briar Hollow at dawn, crossing the fog, without imagining that none of them would return. And it is precisely in this interval, between what is known and what is unknown, that the mystery begins to narrow. The dawn of April 4th, 1891 is described in almost all accounts as exceptionally cold. It was not the kind of cold that came from the wind, but the kind that seems to rise from the ground and settle in the joints, the back of the neck, the fingertips, a damp, silent cold that forced the men to breathe slowly so as not to lose the little heat retained between their thick clothes. It was in this setting that the 30 hunters from Briar Hollow set out, advancing along the dirt road while there were still lanterns lit on the porches. The reconstruction of this moment, made decades later by the professor responsible for the dossier, is based on the memories of children who watched, hidden behind door frames. The long line of men walking in the dark, with sniffer dogs in front and heavy canvas backpacks on their backs. Among them, Silas Crowley kept his steps short, his posture upright, his face partially covered by the woolen scarf he always wore when the temperature dropped too low. Some neighbors said he didn't look back. Others claimed that he did look back, but not at the house, rather at the edge of the woods, as if something there awaited his return. The initial march would have lasted about 6 hours, according to estimates based on the distance between Briar Hollow and the temporary camp mentioned in one of the preserved diaries. That diary, belonging to Jonah Whitlow, one of the most experienced hunters in the group, contains only 4 pages referring to the expedition before being abruptly interrupted. The first page describes the dawn. The low fog gave the impression that we were walking in a river without a current. The sound of footsteps seemed muffled, as if the ground absorbed everything. I saw Silas a few times. He seemed to hear something that none of us could hear. The expression, hearing something, reappears in other later accounts, although it is never specified. Some said that Silas would stop for a few seconds, tilt his head, and then resume walking. Others said it was just an impression, fatigue from the early morning, or perhaps his habit of mapping distant sounds in the woods, a common skill among hunters. By mid-morning, the group reached Hollow Creek, a narrow stream of icy water that served as a natural landmark between the cultivated land and the deeper forest. It was the point beyond which few residents ventured. The trees grew taller, the undergrowth denser, and the air took on that smell of damp earth and resin that only exists in ancient forests. It was there, on the banks of the creek, that Whitlow's diary records something particularly intriguing. Silas walked ahead of everyone as if he knew exactly where to go. He didn't speak. He just pointed north toward the old abandoned cabin. No one questioned him. This decision, to head north to the area where the cabin was located, does not appear in any other official record, but it is confirmed by the direction of the tracks later found by search teams. The terrain in this region is rugged, with steep slopes and moss-covered rocks. The trail easily disappears after rains, and fallen branches often fool even the most experienced hunters. At noon, according to estimates, the 30 men set up a temporary camp to rest. A few small fires were lit, mainly to heat food. The silence of the forest, recounted by the indirect survivors, those who remained, appears repeatedly in the accounts. A heavy, almost material silence. The men would have talked little, partly because of fatigue, partly to conserve breath. But according to the diary, there was a second reason. Perhaps the wind was different, or maybe it was just the feeling that we should have left earlier. Crowley stared at the shadows as if waiting for a sign. The afternoon wore on, and the men resumed their march, climbing a narrow trail that crossed high rocks and exposed roots. The weather, according to records for the region, began to change around 3 in the afternoon. Thick clouds gathered, bringing an early gloom that made visibility difficult. Even so, the group continued. This is where the reconstruction must rely heavily on clues, because Whitlow's journal ends abruptly. The last sentence written is, "Silas stopped. He said we had arrived, but there was nothing but rock and shadow." This note, "There was nothing but rock and shadow," has become one of the most discussed elements in studies of the case, because on maps from that time, there is no record of any structure, additional trail, or landmark in that exact sector of the forest. And yet, subsequent investigations indicate that the tracks of the 30 men converge on this same location, disappearing abruptly a few meters ahead. What happened in the following hours is reconstructed mainly from indirect testimonies, fragmented, contradictory, but with a common thread that reinforces the mystery. A woodcutter working a few miles away claimed to have heard muffled sounds coming from the north at dusk. Not screams, but something he described as voices talking quickly, as if they were deciding something important. Shortly after, silence. The weather changed rapidly. A cold front coming from the hills brought strong winds and light rain. Dusk turned into night ahead of time. For men experienced in hunting, this would not necessarily be a problem, but the conditions described, slippery rocks, narrow trails, thick fog, made any advance extremely dangerous. The chronological reconstruction suggests that the group set up a second camp around 6 p.m., probably on a protected plateau between 2 rock formations. It is at this point that the last concrete evidence of the hunters' whereabouts appears. A fire burned to the ground with boot marks around it, found days later by the teams that began the search. The ashes indicated that the fire had been fed for a short time and abandoned before it burned completely. One of the most disturbing details of this finding is that there were 30 boot marks leaving the camp, but none returning. The footprints headed toward the north slope, the direction of the abandoned cabin. After about 40 meters, they disappeared. They did not go downhill, they did not spread out, they just disappeared. The fog would have completely covered the area. The light rain turned the ground into dark mud. Walking that night required caution. And yet, the search records do not identify any signs of the group falling, slipping, or dispersing. It was as if they had walked in a straight line to a certain point, and from there, simply left no trace. One of the few objects found in that area was Silas Crowley's woolen scarf, caught on a low pine branch, as if it had been torn off by the wind or a sudden movement. The wool was soaked, heavy. The branch, however, showed no signs of struggle, no nail marks, no blood. The scarf was just there, suspended in time. The last possible reconstruction, the one that closes this part of the files, is that of the moment when all sounds ceased. The woodcutter, who claimed to have heard voices early in the evening, also reported that, shortly thereafter, he heard something like a single loud crack, followed by absolute silence. He said he had never heard anything so abrupt in the forest. No animals, no wind, no rain on the leaves, nothing. This report coincides with the estimated time when the fire was abandoned, when, days later, men from the community climbed to the point where the footprints ended. They found only 3 items: the extinguished campfire, Silas's handkerchief, and a set of circular marks on the ground. Marks that did not match boots, animals, or wheels. They were irregular circles, overlapping, almost erased by the rain. No one could determine their origin. The official investigation, limited, poorly resourced, and conducted belatedly, would conclude the report with a laconic sentence: the whereabouts of the 30 men remain unknown. But the unofficial archives, the pastor's notebooks, Margaret's letters, the interrupted diary, suggest that there was more to that night than what was officially recorded. Something that began with Silas staring into the shadows and ended with 30 men walking toward a destination none of them would ever report. The last note, found in the margin of a loose sheet, written in the same nervous hand that had recorded confessional, reads only, "They followed Silas." And then, nothing but blank pages. When the night of April 4th passed without a single lantern appearing on the road back to Briar Hollow, no one was alarmed. Hunters often spent the night in the woods, and it was expected that it would take at least 2 or 3 days for them to return with their first loads of meat and skins. But as the hours passed and the second dawn brought only fog, silence, and the distant sound of crows, families began to realize something no one dared admit aloud. There was no sign of the men. On the third day, the mood in the community changed. The women gathered in small groups, some on the church porch, others in steamy kitchens where hot tea circulated from hand to hand. Margaret Crowley, according to the testimony of 2 neighbors, kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door, as if she expected to hear Silas's heavy footsteps at any moment. She still believed he would return, even when the first searches were organized. The local sheriff, Nathaniel Hargrove, gathered 10 men to follow the hunter's trail. Hargrove was a practical, straightforward man, accustomed to dealing with lost animals, border disputes, and the occasional bar fight. Nothing in his experience had prepared him to track a group of 30 individuals who had simply left no trace of their return. The first search lasted 2 days, and only confirmed what was already feared. The camp from the first night had been found, and further on the second, with the ashes of the fire and marks on the ground that made no sense. The sheriff's initial report describes the group's tension. The footprints cease without logic. There are no signs of attack, struggle, or hasty escape. They just disappear. The forest is silent, as if it had been swept clean. The word "swept" is underlined, a detail that researchers highlight as evidence of the team's genuine astonishment. Upon returning to the community without concrete news, the women began to press for new searches. The second expedition, larger and more organized, included flashlights, sniffer dogs, and provisions for 5 days. They found the same signs again: Silas's handkerchief stuck to the branch, and the circular marks on the ground, this time almost erased by the rain. One of the men, touching these marks with his fingertips, said that the ground felt strangely smooth, as if it had been pressed by something heavy that left no clear imprint. During the search, similar reports began to emerge among the residents. An elderly widow said she heard, on the night of the disappearance, a sound like wood creaking too far away to be a tree. A Methodist pastor visiting the region claimed to have seen at dusk a faint light moving among the hills, something he thought was just the sun reflecting on the fog, but which now seemed suspicious to him. None of this made it into the official documents, but these accounts were repeated and noted in the personal notebooks of the professor who studied the case 40 years later. The deepest unease, however, came from Margaret. Letters found in her trunk, written in the days following the disappearance, reveal the growing despair she tried to hide from others. In one of them, she says, "If Silas had fallen, I would know. If he were injured, I would feel it. But what I feel is absence, as if he had been erased from the world." This phrase has been quoted countless times as the clearest emotional portrait of the impact of the disappearance on Briar Hollow. Because it wasn't just Silas who disappeared. It was fathers, sons, brothers, men who supported their homes and gave meaning to the agricultural life of the community. In the second week, when there was no longer any reasonable hope of finding survivors, the pastor called a collective prayer meeting. The church was full, but no one looked up. The cracked bell was rung, and its irregular sound echoed through the hills like the announcement of a mourning that could not yet be formalized. It was at this meeting that the most enigmatic episode in the post-disappearance records took place. Mrs. Rosalind McAllister, one of the oldest women in the community, stood up and asked permission to speak. She was known for her exceptional memory for names, dates, and stories from the region. In a low voice, she recounted that many years earlier, 3 decades according to her estimate, she had heard her father mention a place north of the forest, informally called the Chamber. It was a place used by old woodcutters for private meetings, conflict resolution, and agreements between men. No one else seemed to remember this, but the term chamber coincided with the note left next to Silas's name in the church book. This testimony reignited speculation. The community began to wonder if the expedition had been motivated not only by hunting, but by some pending agreement between the men. Something never said, perhaps shameful, perhaps dangerous. However, no one could explain why this would involve 30 people, or why no one had returned to report what they had found. The third search, conducted with the help of men from a neighboring town, found new clues, but none of them solid enough to draw a conclusion. In a distant clearing, west of the last campfire, 3 cut ropes of different sizes were found, showing signs of tension, as if they had been used to lift or tie something. The distance between this location and the point where the tracks disappeared was great enough to raise doubts. Were they really from the hunters, or just objects forgotten by woodcutters? There was no answer. As the weeks passed, the time came when Briar Hollow had to continue living. The crops could not wait, supplies were low, and the coming winter threatened to be as severe as the previous one. The women took on heavy tasks. The few men who remained divided responsibilities. Margaret, who initially waited for Silas on the porch, began to occupy herself with helping neighbors, distributing supplies, praying in silence. It was as if she were trying to prevent the emptiness around her from swallowing her up as well. Local authorities sent a formal letter closing the case due to lack of evidence. For Sheriff Hargrove, this official conclusion was almost an affront. He continued to climb the woods alone for months, looking for any sign. A piece of fabric, metal, footprint, bones. He found only silence and wind. Years later, a fact caught the attention of researchers. During renovations at the Briar Hollow Church, a carpenter discovered a loose board behind the altar. There were 3 loose sheets of paper written by the pastor during those days of searching. One of them read, "There are things that men carry together that cannot be exposed without destroying what little the community has. But I fear that what happened in that forest was the consequence of an old mistake that came back to take its toll." That phrase, "old mistake," reignited theories and debates among scholars. There were no names, no explanations, only a suggestion that the disappearance of the 30 hunters was not the result of chance, but of something that preceded the very formation of the expedition. And at the center of it all was always the name of Silas Crowley. Not because he was guilty or innocent, but because his gestures, silences, and last steps seemed to be the thread connecting the past, the present, and the exact moment when the community split in 2. The last formal report on the case, dated the following winter, concludes in an almost resigned manner. Whatever the men found that night, they found together, and they disappeared together. But it is in the informal accounts, in the hidden notebooks, in the crossed-out letters, and in the weary memories of the indirect survivors that the most human revelation emerges. No one really believed that the forest took them. They believed, rather, that they had gone where they shouldn't have, and that something from the past was waiting for them there. Decades after the disappearance of the 30 hunters, Briar Hollow was no longer the same. The main road had been widened, some old houses replaced by newer ones, and the church, after renovations, looked whiter than many residents considered appropriate. That original wood, darkened by years of winter, better held the weight of history, something the new paint couldn't completely hide. The professor responsible for gathering the archives would visit Briar Hollow for the last time in the summer of 1937. He was already a white-haired man with trembling hands, but he still carried the leather briefcase where he kept every note, every letter, every newspaper clipping related to the case. The afternoon sun illuminated the dust suspended in the air as he crossed the bridge over Hollow Creek, noticing that the water was still as cold and clear as in the 1891 reports. It felt as if time had not really moved forward there. It had merely settled on the surfaces like a thin, almost imperceptible layer. He walked along the quiet road, observing the hills that surrounded the community. The forest, denser than in the old maps, seemed to have swallowed up the trails, clearings, and landmarks that once guided experienced men. Some residents still spoke quietly about the case, others avoided the subject altogether. For many, the tragedy had dissolved into routine, transformed into inherited grief, something that was not experienced directly, but which remains a shadow over certain families. The absence of the 30 hunters was still present, even after 46 years, like a void that no new generation had been able to completely fill. The teacher stopped in front of the old Crowley house, now abandoned. The wood, darkened by the rain, the slightly sloping porch and the closed windows painted a picture of a life that had not ended. It had merely been interrupted and left at the exact point where time had stopped. They said Margaret had lived there until her last days, before passing away without ever leaving Briar Hollow. She never fully recovered. Some letters showed that she waited for Silas far beyond what was reasonable. She kept his coat, his tools, his notebooks, especially the one he took with him when he went out alone at dawn, whose purpose was never clarified. Some say that in her final years, she used to sit on the porch at dusk, looking north toward the edge of the woods, as if she expected to see him walking down the path. She never spoke of it. She just stared at the horizon, motionless. When asked by neighbors, she would respond with a slight smile, as if she were keeping a secret too small to share, or too big to explain. The professor entered the house with the permission of a distant relative who looked after the property. The wood creaked under his feet, and the interior had that smell of a place that had been stored away. Old dust, paper, wool, memory. On top of a table he found a few objects. Margaret's Bible, a pair of hand-sewn gloves, an empty ceramic pot, and in a side drawer, something he didn't expect to find, a small folded sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile, with the same slanted handwriting as the church book. It was not a note or a letter. It was just one sentence. He carried something I never knew how to name. The professor sat down and took a deep breath. That note seemed too simple to end such a heavy story, but somehow it contained the essence of what he had been searching for decades. Because among all the documents, among all the interviews, among all the records truncated by time, there was one common element that had never been satisfactorily explained. The idea that Silas Crowley, a man of few words, a hard worker, a devoted husband, walked into the woods as if following something that had been calling him since before his own adulthood. The professor mentally retraced every detail of the investigation: the circular marks on the ground, the absence of return footprints, the soaked handkerchief, the interrupted diary, the women's accounts, the letters laden with melancholy and a kind of silent fear. Everything pointed not to an extraordinary or supernatural event. That would be too simplistic, but to an encounter. The group had found something, someone, or perhaps an uncomfortable truth that had long haunted those families. During the afternoon, the professor walked to the edge of the forest. The wind moved the treetops at a slow, almost contemplative pace. The forest did not seem threatening. It seemed indifferent, as if everything that had happened there had been absorbed by time, becoming part of the landscape. He tried to visualize the 30 men walking, still together, shortly before they disappeared. He tried to imagine Silas looking back, or forward, or into himself. He tried to understand what could have led so many men to go so far, without hesitation, without dispersing. But there was something that escaped him. It had always escaped him. At the end of the afternoon, the professor wrote down in his own notebook, with a blue cover already worn at the edges, the reflection that would conclude his study, published years later. The disappearance of the men of Briar Hollow is not just a geographical, chronological, or community event. It is a wound that spans generations. Not because it has not been solved. Many mysteries are not. but because it involves the gathering of silences, the silence of those who left, those who stayed, and the pages that were never written. He concluded that, in the face of certain events, the truth is diluted between versions, fears, and memories. Perhaps the men followed Silas because they trusted him, perhaps because they shared a burden that no one outside the group was allowed to understand. Perhaps because there are things that men face together and carry together, even if it takes them too far away. At dusk, the professor left Briar Hollow for the last time. The road was empty. Fog was beginning to rise from the hills, just as in the old stories. He looked back before continuing his journey, not out of expectation, but out of respect, as if that gesture were the only possible tribute to the 30 men whose story he had spent his life trying to reconstruct. The woods remained still, silent. The Crowley house, now in shadow, seemed to watch the road as Margaret used to do. There was no answer, no sign, no noise, no trace. Only the same question that has echoed since 1891. How can 30 men walking together simply cease to exist? And the silence that follows is the only answer Briar Hollow has ever offered.